Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the National Foster Parent Association meeting. My name is Mandy Lemon, and I'll be your host for this session. Let's be realistic. After the tragedy in Texas, post-traumatic stress disorder has come to the forefront, even more so. And now that we know that children are more apt to it following COVID, this is such a poignant moment for us to have as foster parents. So let's dive right into it and see what we can do to help folks with post-traumatic stress disorder turn their mess into a message. My name is Mandy Lemon. I am a foster parent as well as a former foster child. I'm an adoptive parent. I am a post-traumatic stress disorder survivor, and I'm an author, and I host a podcast. A little busy, aren't I? But I love it. Very, very thankful. That's me. I'm a motivational speaker, author, foster child, foster parent. And so let me talk to you a little bit about my journey with post-traumatic stress disorder as a foster child, and let's see how it resonates with you and your children. My father brutally murdered my mother when I was 7 years old in our home. He also stabbed me 13 times, nearly ending my life. From there, my father was incarcerated and I was placed in a children's home, aging out at 18, from 7 to 18. That's a long time. The cards were not stacked in my favor, but I like to say it's not the cards you're dealt, it's how you play the hand. With that said, throughout my life, I started to notice trigger moments that would impact me and change my mood like that. Sound familiar? It's true. Post-traumatic stress disorder often has trigger points for many of its constituents. Let's backtrack a little to my story. At the children's home that I lived in, I often suffered name-calling, abuse, verbal, physical, emotional, and the conflict that remained inside me carried on until I graduated from high school at the children's home. Upon graduation, abandonment issues rose their ugly head as I headed to college with just $5 dang in my pocket. So now we have a homeless, hungry, stressed out foster child. You see where this is going, right? My time in foster care was not all bad. I want to make that very, very clear. But growing up in the 80s and 90s as an African American child in a predominantly white community, often I was called some not so nice words. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you, is what I was told by one of the den mothers. Not so much true. We're building a case here, right? As for myself, I graduated from high school and then went to Eastern Kentucky University, where I studied broadcast journalism and married the love of my life. Unfortunately, the marriage ended in divorce after a tragedy involving our foster adopted son. Our Michael was a generational curse child dealing with not only post-traumatic stress disorder, but other mental illnesses. As you'll see, most foster children have some sort of a mental illness. Sorry, sometimes it's hard to talk about. Our Michael, after the death of another foster child, you know we all call each other brothers and sisters. His brother Pell was shot and killed, and Michael went down a horrible, horrible path. His post-traumatic stress disorder led to him running away, marijuana, incarceration, and what's worse, one night, high on drugs, with a gun in hand, he opened fire on the wrong house, blinding a 5-year-old boy. It wasn't his intended target. It was all a revenge, as he says, to validate and unvictimize his foster brother, Pell. So that's a little bit about my story. My post-traumatic stress disorder looks a little like this. See if it resonates. Suffering from PTSD. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? It can look different in foster children, but for the most part, it's a disorder in which a person has difficulty recovering after experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event. What you may find frightening may not frighten me, but for those with PTSD, it can be very, very trigger oriented. The condition may last months or years with triggers, keep that in mind, that can bring back memories of the trauma accompanied by intense emotional and physical reactions. Think about your foster kid wigging out because you asked them to go to McDonald's. Symptoms may include nightmares or unwanted memories of the trauma, avoidance of situations that bring back memories of the trauma, heightened reaction, anxiety, or depressed mood. What does it look like in our foster youth? For me, and scientifically proven, it can exhibit sleep disorders, food and eating issues. Think of the children who hoard. Boundaries. Sometimes they're not set or they're too much. Go in for a hug and get yelled at. The flashbacks for folks who've dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder can often not only create other trigger memories, but it also can trigger you to the point where you develop a psychosis. There are terrors associated with PTSD in our foster youth. Often, as you know, coming into care, we're not trusting anybody. Where is my stuff? How often have you heard that? And then the hyperarousal, the fight or flight. Simply asking a foster child sometimes to pick up their clothes can turn into an argument, or they're packing their stuff and calling the social worker because they didn't like what you said. Is it packing the clothes that's upsetting them or putting them into a plastic bag? Something that triggers, again, PTSD. This is an astounding moment in our history as we look at foster care and post-traumatic stress disorder. According to a Harvard 2005 case study, former foster children suffer PTSD at a rate twice that of a Vietnam War veteran. Twice that of a Vietnam War veteran. That definition of PTSD for a foster child is a condition in which victims of overwhelmed and uncontrollable experiences are subsequently psychologically affected by feelings of intense fear, loss of safety, loss of control, hopelessness, helplessness, and extreme vulnerability. In some children, this disorder is often disclosed and disorganized as agitated behavior. I'm going to pause here for a second and tell a story. Excuse me. Michael, my son, exhibited every one of these to a T. And unfortunately, he was misdiagnosed early on in care. We simply thought that he was still coping with being in foster care. When he was 3 years old, we took him to Disney World. He was getting ready to turn 4 that week. Throughout the week, rather than playing and being excited about what was happening, he had that fear of a loss of safety and loss of control. At one point, Michael would only swim 3 to 4 feet in front of us. Sound familiar? You've got one of those who won't leave your side, or you have one who doesn't want anything to do with you because of their experiences. Michael never grew out of that, and that should have been a key indicator for us. Facts aren't optional when it comes to foster care and foster children who have post-traumatic stress disorder. We are 2 times as likely as a war veteran to have PTSD. 2 times as likely. The fact is, 5 times more likely to have anxiety than their peers. What may simply seem like going to get McDonald's for your other son can turn into a major trauma. Been there. We're 7 more times likely, and I'm saying we because I still consider myself a foster child, 7 times more likely than non-foster kids to face and deal with depression. Cards are not stacking well, are they? 8 out of 10 foster youth, hold up your hands for me. Put down 2 fingers. 8 out of 10 foster children come into care with a notable mental health issue. Often it is not diagnosed, however, and we find out later. Mental health and foster care When you look at the statistics, foster children have a 2.5% times heightened risk in developing mental health disorders compared to those who are never placed into care. Take a thought of that. 2.5% times likely that they will develop a mental illness. Of note, children in foster care are diagnosed with behavioral health issues 5 times as often as their counterparts. PTSD can be a mess. Let's dive into it. Let's spell it out. Mess. M. Your mental health when you are dealing with someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder can range from wide varieties of mood swings to isolation to fear and anxiety. The mental health aspect of PTSD continues to reach the forefront of our communities and our society following the Texas shooting. With that said, mental health experts often will medicate children who have PTSD and misdiagnosis as bipolar or schizophrenia or another mental illness instead of diving deep into what triggers your child. What triggers you? With that said, part of the E that is in the mess that is PTSD is the environment. When we come from an environment that is unsafe, scary, insecure, and then we're placed into a fishbowl that seems perfect, we're going to disrupt. It happens, doesn't it? You can put the most perfect home with the greatest child, but if they're fractured from post-traumatic stress disorder, then they are not going to fit. You're not doing anything wrong. They aren't doing anything wrong. The environment is just not as conducive as what they have been in. I once heard it said, if you've lived in chaos all of your life and you come to calm, you'll get scared. Why? Because it doesn't feel normal. When the earth's been shaking around you and it suddenly stops, you don't know when the next tremor is. Society also has a tendency to ignore PTSD and to place it in the same category as other mental illnesses. I'm going to pause here. Hurt people hurt people. So folks with post-traumatic stress disorder, foster child or not, often will find themselves the victim of society, whether they end up incarcerated because of their mental illness or if they end up simply harming themselves. Society is not equipped currently with our Medicare and Medicaid and the other options for those who are dealing with mental health issues. We're all working on that, aren't we? As for another societal issue that faces those with PTSD, the stigma of having a mental illness alone and then to be told you should get over it. It happened in the past. It may have happened in the past, but it's sitting on my sleeve. I can't shake it. PTSD can be a mess also for you spiritually, questioning why did it happen to me? Here's where I'll delve back into my story. For years, I asked God why my father brutally murdered my mother in front of me, killing her, raping me, and stabbing me 13 times. Let me say that again. My father murdered my mother in front of me, raped me, and stabbed me 13 times. What I was left with was a simple toy that my mother had purchased days before she was killed. At the orphanage, my head was shaved because no one knew what to do with my hair. So to this day, I have hair trauma. So I hate it. As for the spiritual aspect of it, oftentimes we say, turn inward, turn to God. Ask God to help you. He recovers all situations. When fact is, sometimes we need a little medication to help along the way. And the spiritual guidance of meditation can make a difference. More on that in a second. I highly recommend you reading The Body Keeps the Score. It's an exceptional book about trauma and how our lives are interconnected to everything that happens to us, both good and bad. Speaking of which, let's talk about how our body does keep the score. Epigenetics is the study of how events that happen to you and your behaviors, such as trauma events and trauma responses, can change the way your genes work. Yes, you may have blonde hair and blue eyes like mom, but them yelling at you constantly also change the way that your genes work. Again, that fight or flight response. These changes do not affect your DNA sequence, essentially going back again, blonde hair and blue eyes, but they can affect how your body reads your own DNA. Think about that. Something so traumatic that it can alter your body composition. Let me reach into something, and I hope that you'll see the correlation and find the respect that I'm also showing. Holocaust survivors have been shown to show prenatal trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and also anxiety in their children. Let's fast forward to us and now and see that there's an evidence link that can, and I want to pause for a second and allow us to let this information resonate and marinate in our hearts as we continue to find a path of help for those who have experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. Your body does keep a score. In fact, scientifically proven, children exposed to traumatic events experience lifelong lasting negative impacts, including brain impairments, variations to your gene expressions, issues with physical growth and development, complications from forming attachments, serious physical health issues, and significant mental health conditions. Yes, your foster child's body and even your own from traumatic experiences, your body is keeping a score. How often have we seen a child or even watched ourselves completely irrationally react to something? Again, your body's keeping a score. So I want to make a note of this. And if you take nothing else away, please, please understand that there's a reason for your child's behavior. And oftentimes, as noted here, the consequences of the trauma that someone may have faced may mistakenly allow us to misjudge the reason why our foster child or even ourselves are behaving. We may try to restrict, take away things, induce behavior modifications. But unfortunately, due to trauma-informed care research, we are now understanding that those who have a close encounter with foster children will need to demonstrate the ability to deal with trauma-informed care. Why are you acting like this? How often have you wanted to say that? If we'll dive a little deeper, we'll see that usually post-traumatic stress disorder is part of the reason for that outlandish behavior, as I keep referring to, just for a simple task to be done. This is where we stop and we pause and we talk about turning that mess into a message. This is a picture that I love from a photo shoot that I did a couple of weeks ago. I finally felt good about myself again. You see, after my son went on his rampage, I literally lost my mind. I showed up in Tampa, Florida, no bags, nothing, and was hospitalized for post-traumatic stress disorder for almost 2 weeks. While in care, I learned several things about myself that I'd been misdiagnosed as bipolar for almost 13 years. One simple question changed it all. What triggers you? What upsets you? Once the psychotherapist asked that question, she immediately diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's turn that mess into a message. The first M is we are going to meet where they are. Meet me at our spot. We are going to look our children in the eye and we are going to ask them, not in the heat of the moment, mind you, that'll just cause another problem. We're going to meet you where I want to ask children and we want to ask our foster parents to do one simple thing. In the heat of the moment, when that mess of PTSD is rearing its ugly head, I'd like for you to do a 5. Take 5 minutes and have your foster child exit the room while you exit the room as well. And we're going to journal what is happening. Why write it down? Because sometimes when we're in the heat of PTSD, that fight or flight, we have so much adrenaline flying, we don't even know what we're saying. We don't know what we're doing. So what I would like for you to do is with that M in mess is meet them where they are. Understand that you can't fix this situation in this second. It's internal and it's going to take some therapy and it's going to take more than a minute to fix this. As we move along in our mess, we're going to set expectations and expect failures. I'll tell a story about myself. Just as I'd begun my recovery from my divorce, and yes, I got a divorce in the middle of all this. As I'd begun my recovery and continued to move forward, one of the things that I realized is to expect myself to fail at times and to not be perfect and to allow myself those failures. You may have 3 great months with your foster child and then something simple trigger them like that. Let's evaluate what that trigger was. Ask them in a calm moment, not during. What caused this? What was that failure? Next, we're going to set expectations because I'm going to be honest with you, hurt people, but you can't hurt everyone in the house because you're hurting. We're going to set expectations for our foster children that they behave in a certain way and give them guidance and rules. Most people with PTSD, scientifically proving, are high achieving. They've had to step out of themselves, if you will, to deal with the trauma. And they're aware and able and capable of following through with simple tasks such as the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That 5 I'm asking you to do is ask them to take 5 seconds to calm themselves, 5 minutes to calm themselves if they need. And then we are going to set expectations for the next time that this trigger moment happens. We're going to set a 5 seconds. What happens the next time you're triggered? 5 minutes from now, what do you want the conversation to be like? 5 weeks from now, what does this relationship look like between the two of us? And 5 months from now, we're moving on. We've got something else to start. The final S is I want you to share in your foster children's griefs and joys. As a foster child, trust is so often difficult for us to gather and garner. But as you share our grief and understand our stories, we all have one, you'll soon come to understand and acknowledge that a lot of times our grief is something shared that you've experienced yourself. That grief is something that we need to delve deep into. Whether we share the grief with other foster parents in confidence, or we share the grief with their therapist and with them. And those joys, when they finally freaking come, boy, is it going to be good. When I think about the mess that I was in with my foster adopted child, Michael, he won't be coming home anytime soon. His post-traumatic stress disorder and his mental illness led to him committing a horrific crime. But I still today meet him where he is on the days when I need to talk to him from his phone calls. I set expectations for that failure, letting him know that that behavior is not acceptable and we won't have it in our family. Setting expectations for him for the next phone call that he won't yell or scream. And then something as simple as, I expect you to behave like this. No, don't use the word normal because who's normal? And after all, who wants to be normal? That's not nice. Share their griefs and share their joys. That first time that you see someone in your family or even yourself and you realize you could have been triggered or exploded, I want you to do yourself a favor. Celebrate it, whether it's something small as simply as an ice cream or something as large as a vacation. Set up that fund. Take a listen to this as we end our time together. I want to share with you that there is hope for someone dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. While it may seem like a lifelong sentence and illness, it is not. We are healing, not healed, and we will continue to heal. Take a listen. Hey you. Somebody lied to you. They did. No offense. They told you you could not have everything you want. It's a lie. Now go get it. You can have it. Let's talk about hope for a second. Another mechanism that we use in PTSD trauma healing. H stands for healing. Your healing may mean simply writing in a journal daily. Once you find your healing, practice it every day. The O stands for an opportunity. Each misstep is an opportunity to show grace and to show guidance for a foster child or for yourself. Let's talk a little more about that opportunity. As you can see someone getting ready to trigger trauma or to have a trauma from trigger, I'd like for you to take the opportunity to evaluate yourself as a foster parent and have them evaluate themselves as a foster child. What is this situation? What is really happening? Is it the trash you don't want to take out? Or is there something in doing that one simple act that reminds you of something horrific? For me, my triggers, I can't stand loud noises. I'm sure you heard my dogs. It reminds me too much of my time in the orphanage in an environment that I did not feel safe in at times. The P in hope stands for practice. Practice does what? It makes somebody lied to you. In those days and on those times where your foster child or even yourself, they told you could not have your everything best, you want. Practice in your mind what will happen the next time someone triggers you. Here's an example. Dealing with my foster adopted son, Michael, he has a tendency to be very overbearing. And if he doesn't get what he wants at the moment, he's like a smoke alarm, just keeps going off. Each day, I practice myself. What will I say when I speak with him? How do I want to have this conversation? It takes 30 seconds, and you can become an expert at handling trigger and trauma situations by just practicing the P in hope. And as we end, we are going to say the E for hope is everyone counts. Do not despise small beginnings. Sometimes it hurts so badly for us to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and the things that led to us having that PTSD. But just as you have the love for your foster children in your home and the love for your own children and the love for yourself, you matter. Your emotions matter. Your feelings matter. Everyone counts in hope. I'll ask you, with that being said, have a joint discussion with a person who is dealing with PTSD. Not one of those attacking conversations. Well, you said this, you did that. What happens in the calm and in the midst of the peace? Everyone counts. Thank you for joining me for my PTSD conference. I am so thankful and so appreciative for this opportunity. I'd like to add one last thing. Thank you so very much for joining me this afternoon. It has been truly my pleasure to share not only my story with you, but also the hope that there is for folks dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. As I like to say, I'm always just a phone call or text message away. So grab your pen and paper or even your cell phone and type in this phone number should you ever need help.
For my contact information, if you would like to
619-7575.
reach me, feel free to shoot me a text
My
message
email
or a
is
phone
also
call
there at
should you need so at
amanda.lemon@yahoo.com.
859-619-7575.
I truly love
My
serving
email is
other
also
individuals, and it
readily
would be my
available
pleasure
at
to have an initial consult with you and your family
amanda.consult.com. Should you
Thank
or
you
your
so
foster
very much
child
for joining me this
have an
afternoon.
issue
It
with
has been
post-traumatic
truly my
stress
pleasure to
disorder,
serve you.
you
Remember,
are a survivor.
you do not
You
have
are a
to
helper.
be a
You
mess.
are a builder.
Let's turn it into
Let's
a message
continue to work
each day.
together
Thank you so
to
very much for
change
sharing with
lives.
me.
And may God
Thank
bless
you again for joining me. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. It truly has been my pleasure. All the best, Mandy.